Thanks, Cheryl. Cheryl's asked me to talk about disturbances and where early cereal comes from, and so that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to focus on a few topics to do that. And first of all, I think it's important that we have at least some working definition of early cereal, because it is quite a diverse beast, and it comes in different forms and sizes and shapes. And then the disturbances affected in many different ways, and so early cereal from blowdown certainly not the same as early cereal from wildfire. It has different successional pathways. In other words, it can form in different places in the successional sequence, and it can reappear not in a necessarily nice linear fashion. And then touch finally on some regional patterns and trends in disturbance in early successional habitat. So this is a 20-year-old or 25-year-old slide that Jerry Franklin showed me when I first arrived here in the early 80s. And to a large degree, I think it's still valid, although there's some important missing pieces, and I think you might be able to tell them. But it does, let's see, is there anything? Oh, here we go. It does illustrate a couple important points about early cereal. One is in the natural sequence, it's a relatively short-lived part of what is a potentially very long successional sequence in the Pacific Northwest forests. So if you blink, you might miss it. And two, if you look at the managed systems, at least those that are managed under more traditional intensive forest management, the goal is to make this period as short as possible so we can get to the biomass accumulation period. And so there's some real differences. But this 20-year-old or 25-year-old view is missing some important parts. And that is namely the legacies that are created when a wildfire or any natural disturbance occurs, or more ecologically sensitive management disturbances. And so our view of early successional or early cereal has changed quite a bit in recent years as we move to recognize that either under a high severity fire or a high severity disturbance where most of the vegetation is killed, at least the tree layer, there can be considerable remnant material that influences the habitat quality of the open canopy condition. Of course, this is also true of mixed severity fire, where you have live remnants that create a even more complex early successional structure. So with that in mind, here's an attempt at a definition. I'm not sure you'd find this on Wikipedia, but maybe it'll appear there someday. But it's basically a stage of forest succession, so it's a stage. It's something that's in a process that goes on. That's the immediate product of disturbance that removes most of the canopy. That's the fundamental definition. That's the base of it. And from there on, you can build all kinds of different early successional. But you got to get rid of the tree canopy, because it's really about increasing the radiation and light resources to the ecosystem. And so I would define it in this case as stands where you have or areas with less than 20% canopy cover. Depending on what organism you're looking at, that could be higher or lower. But generally, it has to be down fairly low. It has to be a large enough area that you actually are allowing light-demanding plant species to establish. And of course, from a wildlife standpoint, you have other factors that come into play when it comes into the patch size that might favor early successional species. It contains biological legacies from the previous forests, as I mentioned. This is the big discovery, I guess, of the last 20 years in forest ecology. It's not rocket science. It's a fairly primitive science, actually. But to recognize that disturbances actually create lots of dead material, and there are lots of plants and animals that actually carry over from the previous stand, was something that was not well appreciated for many years. And that it's fairly short-lived. 10, 20, 30 years on the productive west side. Depending on site productivity, it can last longer in other ecosystem types. So just a little bit more about what are some of the components after the canopy is gone. The disturbances will remove standing trees in some cases. They'll burn off or remove the understory. They'll burn off or remove the litter layer. They could remove large woody debris in some cases. They can burn off the organic layer of the upper soil, as the biscuit fire did. And if you've got a landslide, they can remove the tree roots. So you can have all degrees of removal associated with the creation of an early successional forest. And if we look across a number of disturbances, you can see that there's quite a bit of variability in, if we're talking about the structural element, wind, basically it doesn't remove anything, it just knocks down the standing trees, blows off the canopy foliage, and so you have a relatively complete structural complexity after the disturbance. Fire, depending on its intensity, can generally remove the canopy foliage. It may remove standing trees if they're small, but if they're large, it doesn't. It generally doesn't remove large woody debris. It certainly burns off the forest floor, understory layer, and can consume the organic layer. Landslides may be the most extreme natural disturbance that's out there, can basically take everything out of it, out of the system, but on a fairly small area. And so they can really kind of do a number on the whole thing. Of course, landslides have a counterpart, which is a debris flow, which deposits that material somewhere else. Then if we go to human disturbances, the most extreme probably from a forest management standpoint is clear cutting and burning, which removes intentionally most of this stuff, and depending on what kind of site preparation, could remove some of the organic matter from the soil. If you go to Australia and look at eucalyptus forest management there, the objective is to get a hottest fire possible after logging to create a mineral soil as a seed bed for tree establishment. So it's often done intentionally. The other way to look at this is look at what remains. And if we think of this as a couple axes here, one is tree canopy closure, where we're down less than 20%. And here we have the large dead legacies, low, moderate, and high. Landslides are really relatively little left. Wildfires in the middle. Wind throw is at the top in terms of what's left. Clear cutting and burning fits down in this lower corner, and I think with management, as you'll probably hear later, the objective is to use retention systems to move to have a system, at least for early succession, where you have more legacies, both live and dead. Just to illustrate some of these, this is blowdown on the Bull Run watershed. In old growth, you can see, of course, lots of root wads and lots of trees present. Incredible structural complexity, incredible amounts of material left on the forest floor, lots of advanced tree regeneration that would have survived the blowdown. High severity fire, you've all seen these in the Northwest. We've had a fairly good share of this in recent decades, but generally, for the most part, all the large standing trees remain. All the dead wood on the ground, at least the larger material remains, and it generally affects the finer material. The litter layer and fine branches may be consumed, but for the most part, much of the organic matter is still there. Despite the large amounts that might be emitted in a wildfire, large percentages are still, a large majority is still on the site. Landslides, as I mentioned, can be quite severe in terms of removal of material. This is the Coast Range. Landslides often are associated with either previous logging activities where they are already occurring on top of an early successional system, or sometimes they often occur if you get the right combination of weather in wildfire, following wildfire, and they can occur within intact forests, albeit really narrow, small patches within riparian systems. There's another type of early seral, or another version of it, which is really long-lived early serals, I would call it. These are places because of either land use history, such as grazing up here in the upper left, or wildfire and extreme ridgetop environments where you basically 50 years or more can go with little or no canopy. And this is another dimension of the early seral management story is, well, where we have places like this already, what about maintaining them? And so it's not just the rapid recovery stage. In some cases, in some environments, it can be a fairly slowly developing, relatively persistent stage. And then, of course, in intensively managed forest land, the objective is to maximize resources for the trees, clear out the dead material, create a pretty homogeneous area. Although there is some patchiness here, you don't see much in the way of dead wood, and there's an attempt in intensively managed to really knock back hardwoods and other sprouting shrubs to maximize growth rates of the trees. So the early seral here is quite a different beast than you would see in a natural successional or natural disturbance system. It's often wondered about whether early seral can pop up when we're talking about small canopy gap disturbances. These occur fairly regularly in the forest, but there's a pretty limited degree to which these contribute to early seral conditions. If we look at sort of a standard way of thinking about openings within a forest, one way to think about it is not the absolute size of the gap or disturbance, but its relative size to the height of the canopy. In this case, the diameter of the gap to the height of the canopy is about 0.5. And in this type of gap, you rarely get early successional plant species, and I would be unlikely to find many early successional animal species present. So to get any beginning evidence of early seral, some work that we've done, you have to really create gaps where the opening is at least as large as the height of the canopy. This can work in any size forest. Of course, if you do it in a young forest and you have a rapidly growing canopy, rapidly height-growing canopy, you can change the opening size pretty rapidly over a few years, and so you may lose the persistence of some of that open condition. But this is sort of the minimum size, and for many early seral species and organisms, this is probably still too small. But you begin to see in our wetter forests where some of that early seral might persist as small pockets. It's interesting because we've done some experiments in gaps, and we've found that even where we create fairly small gaps, we'll get early seral species, Senecio and other kinds of invasives sometimes, popping up in those gaps. And they obviously persist in the landscape in many different places. So they can get there, but they generally don't last very long. This is illustrated here by looking at gap size distribution as a function of the relative gap diameter to height ratio. As you see, this is a survey of mature and old forests. Most of the gaps that we saw in this particular survey were much smaller than the 0.5 there, and we found relatively few that we didn't find any in this particular survey that were 1.0 in terms of that ratio. So the normal gap processes generally don't get us there in terms of early seral. Now the story, I think, is different if we get over into drier forest types. Here we've got much lower canopy density and cover to begin with, and here patchy fires such as the biscuit fire that could create some sort of gaps, or here on the east slope of the Cascades where you have patchy fire. I think in this case gaps created by fire or other natural disturbances in these environments, say insects and disease, could create early seral habitat within the context of the forest. This just illustrates the historical dynamics in ponderosa pine, where you basically have kind of a gappy, relatively open canopy, and in places like this where you have hotter burning going on, this would be the place to find early seral species, and largely because the background canopy, the context canopy, is often fairly open, and so the additional light and resources created by this gap on top of what's already available in a fairly open canopy make gap and small-scale processes more possible to create early seral conditions. The threat to early seral in this environment is fire suppression, where you begin to really fill in the canopy. What about early seral and where it occurs? This is the standard successional sequence that we often talk about, where we have a early seral condition created by wildfire, then we move into mature and old growth. Real simple, 8th grade kind of succession story. But in reality, if we look at the disturbance history of these stands, we find that it's much more complex. Early seral pops up in many places, and it pops up not just with the demise of an old forest, such as this yellow, which is a large disturbance moving things back, but it pops up when young forest or mature forest is burned and moved back into early seral with different remnants. So the actual initial conditions of the early seral vegetation can play an important role, and they're not just old growth as the source habitat. It can often be very young forest or even non-forest conditions. And this is illustrated by some work that we've done in the biscuit fire, where we asked the question, how did this fire burn, and where did the high severity patches of vegetation come from? or that they more likely come from the old forest, where you might think that because of buildup of fuels, you had ladder fuels, you had lots of material there to burn? Or did they come from early successional conditions or mid-successional conditions? Or did they come from places that had burned previously in the silver fire 20 years before? And as it turns out, if we look at where the crown damage across the biscuit was 74% overall. But if we look at these cover types, we see that there's quite a range of difference in the likelihood of that cover type being burned with high severity and creating early seral conditions. It's much higher if we're talking about the shrub and regeneration stages. 96% of the natural and planted young regeneration stages burned with high severity in the biscuit fire. Whereas the other end of the extreme, large conifers, which would be the old growth equivalent down there, only 32%. So in this case, the older forest was relatively resistant to creation of early seral, whereas the younger forest, or the hardwoods, which have thin bark and were readily killed by the fire, were more likely to be sources of early seral. This pattern could be quite different depending where you are in the region. I suspect it might be different in the B&B fire. It could be the opposite there, particularly if the older forest had accumulations of fuel, and the younger forest, because of low productivity, had relatively low fuel accumulation. You could imagine this whole thing being flipped around. So this is just one example of the variability. What about how much early seral did we have historically? Of course, we don't know this very well. We don't really have the long-term disturbance records to piece that together very well, but we can use some simulation modeling to kind of get at that. And we estimate from one study in the Coast Range that probably 10 to 25% of that landscape was in an early seral condition over the period of the last several thousand years under what might be called the natural wildfire regime of that province. Old growth, on the other hand, probably occupied between 35 to 60%, depending on what you're talking about. And if you look at the landscape as a whole, it would have been dominated by mature and old forest, but there would have been periods and pockets where you had substantial area of early seral, because again, in the Coast Range, this area is subject to long interval but fairly large high severity wildfire. So in terms of where we are today, at least by one measure of early seral, we're actually within the range, but this doesn't necessarily account for the ecological diversity of the condition. This is just based on age, and so it would include young areas on industrial forest land as well as Forest Service land. If we look at the recent trends in creation of early seral from old forest, this is wildfire conversion of old forest to early successional from 1993 to 2003. And so this is basically the percent loss of older forest on a decadal basis. So we lost about 3.6% during that decade of the old forest here, 9.5% of the old forest here, if you count high severity wildfire as a source of early seral. But then there are other parts of the region, like coastal areas and some of the Cascade areas, where the losses to wildfire have essentially been non-existent, at least from an old forest standpoint. So there's quite a variability across the region in the natural creation of old forest from wildfire, early successional forest from wildfire over the last decade or so. And if we're thinking about places where we might have a limitation or might have a desire to create more early seral forest from a ecologically diverse early seral, I should preface that, it's probably these wetter coastal areas where we haven't had much natural creation of wildfire, of early seral, in the last decade or so. This is some projections that we've done, again, in the Oregon Coast Range, of trends in cover types under what we call the base policy, that is the Northwest Forest Plan and our best estimates of what state and private land management would be across this multi-ownership area. And you can see, of course, as expected, these are different, basically different vegetation cover types. The large and very large old forest are expected to increase dramatically as the federal policies really kick into place. But there's also an expected decline in open, diverse forest, as indicated here, from the base period we modeled this out for about 100 years. And so this is, of course, as a result of what's happening on federal land, where thinning is the main activity and there isn't much creation of early seral, and the efforts on industrial land to really shorten the early seral condition and get trees in pretty rapidly because they want to shorten the overall rotation. And so this basically squeezes early seral out of the landscape in this particular area. The other interesting thing here to note is that hardwood forests are expected to decline, and maybe that, Cheryl, should be the workshop theme of your next workshop, because that's certainly associated with early seral, and in some cases you could assign hardwood conditions to early seral if you think about it from a broader forest condition, because early hardwood forests provide an enormous amount of biodiversity within a conifer-dominated landscape. So just a few conclusions then. Basically, all early seral forests share the same element, that is the loss of the canopy to pretty low levels. The disturbances create all kinds of different early seral vegetation in the landscape, so it's very difficult to generalize when we talk about early seral. It's one of those things, it's a bit like old growth. There are many different definitions of it, and so if we have a discussion about early seral, I think it's important that we define exactly what we're talking about, and also recognize that depending on the species you're talking about, one species early seral may not be another species early seral. It's a transitory stage that lasts 15 to 30 years, depending on site productivity, and in some cases we've had persistent early seral on hot, dry sites or extreme sites, and that's another dimension to early seral management, is perhaps maintaining these sort of slowly closing openings in the landscape. Canopy gaps have a limited ability to provide early seral in the wetter, more productive forests, mainly because you already have pretty high canopy cover, and addition of a small opening doesn't add much to the resources for the ecosystem. However, I think those small patch disturbances can provide early seral in drier types, and this is actually an area that probably would be benefit from some additional research. Early seral can pop up at any time in any place. Some successional stages are more or less susceptible to creating early seral, and it's going to likely vary across the landscape. The rate of early seral has varied over time. We know certainly there have been burning periods in the past, certainly the last human history, but also in the longer-term fire history of the region, there's been burning periods that have created lots of early seral and other periods where there's been relatively little. So it's variable creation rate. The amount of diverse early seral, defined by dead and live and all kinds of structural complexity, is declining in the wetter forest, largely because of the squeeze process between federal land management and industrial and private land management. And that early seral created in intensive forest management is not the same and does not provide the same habitat capability that you get from natural disturbances, although we'll hear later of ways that we can modify management regimes to deal with that. And with that, I will stop, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
We have 5 minutes for questions. If you have one, just stand up and speak it. Bring back.
Tom, I just have a few questions about early seral stages that are created maybe through lower to mixed severity fires, especially in the mixed conifer areas on the west side of the Cascade. You use the examples of the ponderosa pine. Just wondering if you had any information about the Doug fir.
Yeah, I think the Doug fir series on the west side, on hotter, drier sites, can be a reservoir for at least plant species that I'm aware of, grasses and other early high, light-demanding shrubs. And certainly, if you take Douglas fir regeneration as an indicator of early seral, you find it there. So yeah, I think those are places where it would be sites where you might expect that management activities that created small gaps or patches or underburning would provide some components of the early seral spectrum that's out in the landscape. So on the west side, I definitely agree that those areas would be good sort of hot spots for early seral in the landscape. And I think in some cases where we have long intervals without fire, those are probably the places, or at least large intense fires, those are probably the places that were sort of reservoirs for some early successional species in the conifer-dominated landscapes.
Are there any size, like sterile areas that you found to be more productive than others? Like what is the average size that is recommended?
Size of opening, you mean, or?
Yes. Besides just the one, I mean, I know it said that the one canopy height was
Yeah.
the minimum, but what would be a recommended size?
Well, yeah, that's the $64,000 question. It's related to, you know, how much do we need, but it all depends on what organisms and processes you're trying to deal with. I would say probably most of the species that we're talking about here, an opening of one tree height diameter would be insufficient to provide a lot of early seral habitat. So if you look at sort of natural disturbances, you really have to get up to many, many hectares or acres before that edge effect of that surrounding canopy is kind of pushed back and you have what's kind of a pure open condition. But for wildlife species with territorial issues, that size can be quite variable. But it's hard to say. But certainly, if you really were looking to create some big persistent patches, they would have to be many, many acres in size, tens to hundreds of acres in size, I think.
Tom, in your projection that you had for the, you said that for the Northwest Forest Plan, was that like 2026 that you projected it, or is that today's sense in terms of what really the Northwest Forest Plan has?
Well, that was based on '96, but we pretty much, the assumptions we used in that modeling were pretty much like what's happening now, and this is focused on the Coast Range, and we were assuming no regeneration harvest. Because the Sayusla basically has no matrix that it's working in. And so much of the rest of the federal land is moving to sort of a Sayusla model where thinning is the dominant activity. So I would assume that that would play out across other areas as well. Okay, thank you.